Hey guys, it's Scott with Scotty B Cards, and in this video I want to talk about which players I target and why. Every once in a while, I will get an Instagram message or a comment on YouTube asking if a certain player is a good buy and if the rookie cards are a good buy. And I don't really like to tell people who to buy just because I don't want to be responsible if it goes bad or if it goes good and so forth. I want to make sure you're making decisions based off of what you think is best. But in this video, I want to show you how I decide what players I want to purchase and the factors I look at to make sure it's someone I believe in long term or even in the short to mid term. Primarily, I look mid to long term though, as you'll see as we go through this. But before we start, if you are a sports card, trading card, baseball card fan, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything. I post 2 to 3 times every single week. All right, so very first thing, when you're looking to buy cards of a player, whether you're a collector or investor, a hybrid of both of those things, which I probably would categorize myself as, you want your cards to increase. And a lot of times, if you're looking for the long term, you want to PC players that have potential to be good long term. So that's what I look at when looking at these things. But whether you're a collector or an investor, this does apply to you because I think all of us want our cards to increase. We don't buy a card and say, man, I hope that drops in price. Unless it's like a Billy Butler Black like this right here. I have no intention for that card to be worth much, but at the same time, if I'm buying a card for more than $10, $20, it gets to that point. Some players can be short to mid-term buys, while others can be really good long-term buys. So in this video, I'm looking again at mid to long-term buys and not really focusing on the short-term buys because any single player in Major League Baseball will have a hot stretch and you can have a good little flip on that specific player. Identifying how you view a player before you buy and your exit strategy is important. Make sure you know who you're buying and kind of what you predict their career is going to be relatively like, so you know when you want to sell that player's cards or if you want to hold them forever because you think it's going to be a very good long-term hold. Just know what your plan is for the card before you buy it, because if not, you'll buy something you don't really want and then it's hard to get rid of because of the liquid, or you might have a little bit of a bad stretch and so forth. And the hobby is not self-funding, so that's why I talk about this, because I look for players I think can increase. For me, I try not to use any of my personal money on the hobby. I try to use only money from the hobby to fund the hobby and just make smart decisions. So the one thing I think is the most important about buying a player's cards is an early debut. Reason for that, if you're looking long term, if you want them to reach the Hall of Fame, to have your card collection go from good to great because this player made the Hall of Fame, they need to debut early. In 2018, the position players debuted at age 24.4 years old, while pitchers were at 25.3 years old. But the average Hall of Famer since 1965, that's when players started to get drafted, is 21 years old. And that's just the average. The actual median, which you actually look right in the middle, is 21 again. So we're seeing there is a very big age gap between 21 and 24. That's because those early years are critical for getting counting stats, gaining WAR, getting home run totals. All these different things are extremely important. Same with all-star appearances, MVP votes, all these things the voters look at. The earlier you get in the league, the better. It also allows you to hit your prime earlier and have a longer prime because you're hitting your prime at age 26 after you've been in the league for 5 years versus hitting your prime at age 29 after being in the league for 5 years if you debut at 24, for example. So how many Hall of Famers debuted age 23 or later? And since 1965, that is. And this doesn't include steroid guys, obviously, but only 10. Only 10 players who are in the Hall of Fame since 1965. Since there was a MLB draft, only 10 of them have been 23 or later at debut. How about age 24? Only 6 players. Age 25, only 2 players. And both of those players are relief pitchers, Trevor Hoffman and Mariano Rivera. So this just highlights the importance of debuting early. So I just want to point that out very first. The next thing I look at, and this is an obvious one, is relative success at a young age. These are all very, very drastic examples of players who've been amazing right as they debut. But I like all these players because it has both points. They debuted early, and on top of that, they had success at an early age. It's too early to say how all these players' careers will end up. It's too bad Tatis hasn't played much this year. But for Juan Soto, for example, I saw his on-base percentage, how much he was walking, his high average, and his ability to go all fields with his power. I liked everything about that, so that's why I bought his cards early, because of that relative success. You know, if you have a player who's hitting above an 820 OPS or an OPS plus above 120, that's a pretty dang good sign that it's a good player to buy. And so relative success, whatever you categorize that as, you want to have this at a young enough age, not just a debut, but actual relative success, because players debut and struggle for a few years before they figure it out. But if they can have both of those things, it makes them a good candidate for long-term value. The next thing is a low number of sets. And this one sounds obvious, or it might even be new to you, however you want to look at it, because I talk about it all the time on my channel. But you want a player who does not have 30 sets. A lot of players now, let's say Jazz Chisholm. I have Jazz versus Andrew Vaughn right here, but Jazz Chisholm has a ton of cards. He has a ton of different sets. Same with, let's look at Yordan Alvarez. Let's look at Wander Franco, will have a ton. And because of that, all the cards put downwards pressure on themselves besides the top of the top. Let's say the top's Chrome Refractors or the flagship parallels. Things like that will hold value. But everything in the middle, maybe like the finest or Sterling rookies, they just really can't appreciate appreciate because there's so much quantity out there. That's why like Mike Trout has a 7 rookie sets, like actual base rookie cards, while Bryce Harper has about 15 to 16, for example. And then Juan Soto versus Ronald Acuna. Soto and Acuna are both in update, but Acuna had a lot more sets early, and because of that, Soto has a little bit more value since he only has 1 Chromium card. It's the Topps Chrome update. I guess he has 2 with Bowman's Best if you want to count it, but Ronald Acuna Jr. is also in Topps Chrome, for example, which puts downward pressure on his Topps Chrome and his Topps Chrome update. It gets really difficult to maintain value across all brands. Then you have Will Smith versus Vladimir Guerrero Jr. I'm not saying to buy Will Smith versus Vladimir Guerrero Jr. I'm just saying Will Smith has hardly any sets versus Vlad, and because of that, it creates a very interesting opportunity for you to get some really rare cards of his iconic cards early, so that way people are like, oh man, Shane Bieber, he's really good, or Will Smith, he's really good. They only can go for these rare cards that you're already holding. The right stats. This is something I talk about all the time. I talk about stats probably to a fault on my channel. I'm sure some people don't love that, but the right stats are important when identifying young players. A lot of young players have very athletic player profiles. They're able to steal bases. They're able to do some things that are great for a young player, but a lot of times they age out of that really, really quickly. The baseball season's long, and once you hit age 25, and let's say you debut to age 21, you have 4 or 5 years under your belt, it gets hard to maintain stolen base production. It gets hard to maintain defensive value. All these things that really help your WAR totals or your career Hall of Fame probability, they go down because it gets harder as you age. So I personally look for defensive stats first, not as like my number one go-to. If I'm looking to buy a player, I check this out because defensive stats show that a player can maintain a position for their entire career. Back to Billy Butler, wasn't a great defender because that he was put at DH, and once he wasn't hitting his very best to like a 120 OPS plus, for example, he wasn't providing enough value at the DH to really maintain his spot. I don't think that was fair to Billy, but you get the whole point. It's just that same argument. We saw it with Chris Carter, we saw it with Prince Fielder, we saw it with a lot of great players who, unless you can field, it's hard to play into your 30s, and if you're trying to get to the Hall of Fame or have a long-term value, you want to be playing into your mid-30s to early 40s even, because that's how you can actually gain all the stats needed to make the Hall of Fame. Then you have on-base percentage. I think this is important because you cannot really teach on-base percentage. It's really hard to teach someone to take pitches. You can teach someone to slug, and they can actually start to slug as they age and their body fills in. So I think on-base percentage is one of the most important stats to look at. OPS plus compares the OPS of a player, which is on-base plus slugging, compared to the average player in Major League Baseball. So a 120 OPS plus means they're 20% better than league average. And WAR is a total accumulative stat between offensive runs, and WAR is a total stat between offensive runs, base running runs, defensive runs, everything put into one package to really get an overall value of a player. And WAR is something people don't really like in multiple ways. Traditional WAR is bad, but a lot of traditional baseball fans don't like WAR because it is a sabermetric type stat, hard to understand. If you dig into it, it's pretty straightforward. It's just basically the all-around players get the most value for their team, which helps their WAR totals. Traditional stats are extremely important. I want to make sure I point that out. Home run, batting average, RBI, all those are so important because that's how a lot of players are valued. Just with the media, with MVP voting, all these things are still important. I just think sometimes some of these traditional stats overweigh some of the underlying advanced metrics that show if a player could be good long-term. Collectibility, the last one. This is important because are they exciting? Will they be remembered? We all have memories if you're old enough to remember Ken Griffey Jr. and his sweet swing and how good he was with Seattle, and even for a few years with the Reds, and just his natural, beautiful, left-handed swing. Then we have Juan Soto doing great things in the World Series in 2019 and the Soto Shuffle. All these different players that really get memorable in our minds are the ones that maintain value. There's arguments for some Hall of Famers being a little bit overrated, but because of their collectability, they maintain the most value. I'm not going to say who I think that is, but a lot of people like these players I'm thinking of. Even though their stats and their performance isn't the best ever, they're very collectible because of who they were. So that is a very important part. And if you look for a player with all 5 of these things, that's how you can gain value. For you, you might pick 3 to 4 of these things. Let's say they're not very collectible, but they have everything else. Let's say Paul Goldschmidt. That's a great example. Somebody has everything but collectability. Or if you want somebody who has collectability, but not necessarily the best on-base tool. It's just a traditional slugger, for example. All these things you have to consider and look what's important for you. That's why I've landed on Juan Soto, because I think he has basically everything. He's struggling this year and sells a 140 OPS plus. His batting average is down. He'll figure it out. I have no doubt in my mind he'll figure it out. But that's what I personally look for. One thing I will say is be careful with this because not every player who looks great early is going to maintain value. The player I want to look at is Jason Hayward. Jason Hayward has almost 40 career WAR, which is better than probably minor league baseball will be in the future. But he started out in his career. Here's his overall page. His first year, he had a 131 OPS plus. He was 20 years old. He had 18 home runs, 72 RBI. He was top, MVP votes. All these things would have made me think Jason Hayward's the guy to buy. But if we look at Jason Hayward's career after that, again, 40 WAR is nothing to sneeze at. That's a great MLB career, but it's not going to maintain value in the long term. You really want to try to identify the right players early because if you can get lucky doing that, that's how you have value. So anyways, those are my thoughts. That's how I personally evaluate players. That's why I've landed on Mookie Betts, Mike Trout's obvious, Juan Soto, Paul Goldschmidt. I have some some pitching information I didn't put in here, but I also like Zach Greinke. All these players I viewed as undervalued with all of these things to be remembered and to be maintaining their value. That's who I buy. So other than that, thank you for watching, guys. Let me know in the comments below what you look for when buying players, and I will see you in the next video.